Alrighty. Today we have Dr. Airic Huges with us. He's an entrepreneur, artist, philanthropist, and faculty member in the Department of History at the University of Arkansas. His research examines Black geographies in America through the lens of federal interstate development in Little Rock. Airic was recognized as a Southeastern Conference Emerging Scholar for 2022-2023. He also founded Visionary Enterprises in 2016. Visionary produces films, media, and events with a mission to promote and preserve Black culture through education, creativity, and social justice. Airic has done 2 other talks with CALS before, and I sent out links to those today. But if you'd like me to send them to you again, I'd be happy to email them. The chat doesn't get preserved, so I don't see a point in putting it in there. But I'd be happy to share them with you if you didn't get those in the email. And without further ado, I will let Airic take it away.
Thank you, Danielle and Ranger, for the invitation to come and join your book club and talk about this amazing text, The Color of Law. As a historian at the university, I talk about, and as a researcher, I talk about these topics. And one of the things that I was sharing with Ranger and Danielle before we started this evening is I believe what I hope to achieve in this short time tonight is to provide some context to the conversations that Richard Rothstein wrote about and that you all read about and we'll talk about this evening. So I guess I can start with one of the introductory quotes that Rothstein gives in his preface. He says, the shifting of terminology should not distract us from this underlying truth. We have created a caste system in this country which with African Americans kept exploited and geographically separate by racially explicit government policies. And in an effort to contextualize this conversation, one of the first things that I want to highlight is to extend the timeline for this conversation. Richard Rothstein is looking at how government policies such as urban renewal were achieving goals of segregation in the 20th century, but this conversation about segregation in America extends far beyond that. This conversation about segregation in America is a conversation about citizenship and a conversation of the boundaries of freedom. And so when we talk about the realities of this conversation of citizenship and the boundaries of freedom for African Americans, we can extend this timeline well before the existence of the country itself. When you look at incidents in our colonial history, such as Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, this collection of individuals who were of African descent, of Native descent, and of European descent revealed growing class distinctions within our colonial experience that would compel colonial officials to start to utilize race as a tool of division, right? And so even when we move the timeline into our early American Republic and we look at individuals who are some of our leading proponents of the ideals of the American Revolution, freedom, democracy, equality, these are individuals who are also using government policies such as the 1790 Naturalization Act to limit citizenship and naturalization for people who are not white. And so this is, again, connecting this conversation about citizenship and the boundaries of freedom, right? And when you look at even this conversation about the relationship of race and citizenship, there is the movement for independence creates this paradox in our national development over who are these people that our Declaration of Independence declares are equal. And so these the policymakers and Declaration of Independence writers such as Thomas Jefferson, these are some of the leading individuals who are promoting the concepts that the end of slavery does not promote the essence of equality or the existence of equality in society, and that people of African descent who were supposed to be a part of this all people created equal should actually be removed from the country. And you see the existence of this through the creation of colonization efforts such as the American Colonization Society in 1816, which was an effort to remove free Black people from the United States and take them back to recolonize spaces in Africa. And so this is an extension of this conversation about how white and Black populations coexist in our national history. And Richard Rothstein picks up this conversation in an era after our civil conflict, and when we move into a period of our national history that is reflective of urbanization and industrialization. At the turn of our 20th centuries, our urban spaces began to grow in population because of a number of factors, including the transition of many Southern economies into a more Northern style industrial production model. And so you would see people migrating to these industrial cities from around the world. You would see European immigrants coming into American cities. And then you would also see Black migrants from Southern cities coming into these urban spaces as well in Northern cities. And they were coming for in a variety of migration waves, such as the post-emancipation wave, where you saw Black people move into Western cities. And then if you move into the 20th century, closer to Rothstein's era, the migration waves in World War I and World War II, these are bringing Black people to urban cities. And so as Black people are moving to urban cities, there are factors that are pushing them away from these rural plantation backgrounds, which the majority of Black people lived in up until these first waves of migration. There are push factors such as violence that is occurring even throughout the South. You can find numerous incidents in our state history of racial violence. Even in the city of Little Rock, the lynching of John Carter in 1927 is a major point of racial violence that moved many Black people out of the state of Arkansas. And so these type of violence, as well as limitations on access to land ownership and second-class citizenship, the lack of access to political opportunities, were pushing African Americans out of these rural spaces. And there were things that were pulling them into these rural spaces, such as the opportunity for industrial jobs in these many northern cities, as well as a greater access to political citizenship and greater access to self-determination, particularly through things such as military service. Black people were going to enlist in the military and moving to these urban cities where they could do so. And so this is around the nation that these transitions are affecting where Black people live and changing these patterns. And even if you look around the South, regionally, there are the reflections of this through different economic transitions, such as the New South philosophy that people like Henry Grady in Atlanta would promote, to where there was an effort to diversify Southern economies and move away from a singularly plantation focus into more industrial and diversified opportunities. And so in states such as Arkansas, you saw the growth of urban populations, and particularly urban Black populations in southern cities, including Atlanta, Mobile, Memphis, and in Little Rock. And so as Black people moved into these cities, this age-old question that has existed from this colonial time about where Black people will live and how Black and white people will live together in these urban spaces begins to motivate the use of different tools to begin to reshape solutions for these old questions, right? And one of the things that began to push urban developers and city officials in the early 20th century to do so is not only the increase of these Black populations, but also the ramifications of these growing Black populations. And I'll just give you a few to give you some context. There are movements that are occurring to assist these Black people that are moving into urban cities, such as Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. There are cultural manifestations of these collections of Black people in spaces such as Harlem, New York, that include the Harlem Renaissance, these explosions of Black culture that take these conversations on the mainstream and even draw white New Yorkers down into these Black urban spaces. And on a local, or even the creation of entirely Black cities themselves, and such as Nicodemus, Kansas, right? So you have these growing Black spaces, and even in Little Rock, you have these growing Black communities, such as the community of West 9th Street, where you have a thriving Black economy, a thriving Black entertainment district that white citizens in Central Arkansas come and patronize just as well. But we are still in a time of segregation, and the Plessy versus Ferguson law is our national policy that allows for the enforcement of these different experiences based on your race. And so as we see this increase in Black populations in urban spaces, you see an increase in competition over political supremacy, over economic opportunity. And this competition is largely broken up by class. You see the poor urbanites, the poor white urbanites began to feel the pressure of these increased Black populations, and the policy and decision makers in cities throughout the South began to have to come up with solutions for these increased anxieties. And so one of the solutions that are proposed in the early 20th century is this process of urban renewal. Richard Rothstein picks up this conversation talking about these processes beginning in cities such as Baltimore in 1910. But when you look at what is occurring contextually around the country, we are in the heart of a era known as progressivism. And this era of progressivism is a shift in our national understandings of how our country should be constructed. This era of progressivism is important because it introduces a couple of key concepts. The first is that there is a distinct effort to improve society, right, in a number of capacities. So you see an increased examination on the issues in society, increased reliance on experts to come up with solutions for these type of social problems and economic issues. And then also, because of the tools of progressivism, you see an idea in which we all subscribe to today, the sacrifice of the good of some, or the sacrifice of the good or freedoms of some for the benefit of larger society. And we all subscribe to that notion in your driving. When you pull up to a four-way stop, there is nobody forcing you to stop at that stop sign, but we all do it because we understand that this is for the larger good of everyone here at this stop. This is a progressive notion, right? That you can give up some aspects of your freedom and your decision-making capacity for the good of others as a whole. And so this language of progressivism would provide the means by which you would see city officials begin to create solutions for this question of how do Black and white people begin to live together. And in looking at the language of this progressive movement, you see this concept of the sacrificing of the good of some for the benefit of the larger whole through the reflection of dynamics such as eminent domain. Eminent domain will allow for the taking of land from some people for the benefit of others. Who gets to make those decisions is really the key understanding that people such as Richard Rothstein are highlighting with his text. And so even concepts such as the right of way, when you watch Tanisha Joe Conway's film Dreamland, there's a scene in the film Dreamland in which there's an older Black community member who's walking around pointing to where different buildings used to be. And he pointed to a sewer sign, and it was the city of Little Rock, and it said right of way on the sewer line. The right of way, eminent domain, these are progressive ideas. These come from this progressive era movement. And so this allows for the targeted of specific communities using the language of state will. You would see urban planners begin to use surveys and studies and collect racialized data to begin to justify the desire to renew these blighted areas and blighted communities, right? And so the language of progressivism and the language of state will is what allows for these urban renewal processes to begin in cities around America. And when my research picks up, I talk about how urban planners receive an entirely new tool to continue their process in the creation of our interstate defense system, national interstate defense system, which allows them to continue these providing these solutions of where Black and brown people will live in proximity to where white people will live in urban spaces. And so in Little Rock, this reflects early in the 20th century. You see city planners such as John Nolan began plans for a East-West Expressway as early as the 1930s in Little Rock, Arkansas. And this is a desire to create an expressway that will connect the growing Western communities in the city of Little Rock with the more centralized urban communities in Little Rock. And so as these city planners began to develop these early efforts to reconstruct the city, they ran out of funding. And as they ran out of funding, the initial East-West Expressway was not a part of this early national interstate defense system that was created in the Eisenhower administration. And so you would see the question that I received from Danielle to contextualize how these conversations apply to Little Rock, I think can really be gleaned by these key connections, right? So because this East-West Expressway lost the steam to continue the execution of this project, there was a distinct effort from citizens of means and community leaders throughout the city to begin to reinvigorate this effort using a potential to connect the East-West Expressway to the growing National Interstate Defense System. So you saw local interests, such as groups including 50 for the Future, which still exists today, engage with city officials such as the executive director of the Little Rock Housing Authority at the time. His name was John Miller Jr. And John Miller Jr. was essentially recruited by 50 by the Future to become a lobbyist for these urban redevelopment interests. And so George Miller Jr. would begin to lobby Wilbur D. Mills, who at the time was the National Ways and Means chairman in our Congress and was probably one of the most important national officials in controlling our national budgets. And he happened to be an Arkansas native. And so George Miller Jr. lobbied Wilbur D. Mills to add the East-West Expressway into our national interstate defense system. And so this is how the funding for what will be created as I-630 or Interstate 630 actually is connected. And the timeline for these connections is important because the urban renewal process nationally begins in earnest in the 1930s. And as we move into the era of the interstate construction generation, we're talking about the post-World War II era and throughout the 1950s, which is how do I want to say this? It is historically convenient, at the very least, that the interstate defense system that is grown throughout the 1950s occurs at the same time that our national public education system is being desegregated in 1954, right? And so you have this timeline that is occurring of our national history that does not happen in a vacuum, right? And so the growth of our national interstate defense systems and even the incorporation of projects such as Interstate 630, which didn't begin in Little Rock in earnest until the 1960s, is a reflection of the anxieties as well as the distinct intent in responding to the changes in our urban configurations. These Black students in Little Rock in 1957 are desegregating national schools because there is a growing Black population of Little Rock citizens, and they are demanding first-class citizenship. And so these tools that urban planners use are able to be implemented and able to be justified using the language of state will, despite the fact that the surveys themselves, the aerial studies, a lot of this information that was collected to justify the development of these programs use racialized data. The fact that these programs themselves are utilized for the growth of city development, and through the use of tools such as eminent domain allows for these programs to be coolly and calmly implemented as efforts to move the city in a progressive direction, right? And so despite the fact that these communities that are targeted are largely African American communities, traditionally African American communities, and they are targeted because they offer the least resistance to these legal policies that are removing their land ownership and access, and ultimately their citizenship. And so when we talk about the concepts that Rothstein introduces, it's important to have this larger context about what's going on nationally and locally that's influencing the decisions of these city officials. And so I think I'll stop there and we can just continue our conversation, because I actually teach this stuff over the course of a semester, and I don't want to necessarily take up the rest of your book club time without providing time for you all to ask questions.